The program today, which I'll mention in just a minute, is sponsored by both a Jewish Studies and an Israel Studies program. So we can start by making jokes about Jewish Standard Time or Israel Standard Time and whether you should wait 5 minutes or not. But in the age of online programming, I think there's nothing better than following the German Jewish tradition, which is to be German and Swiss and start right on time. So it's 1 o'clock. I think we'll get started. My name is Scott Lasensky. I'm joined today by colleagues from the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies, Paul Sham, who's the acting director, Avis Kleeman. I want to thank her not at the end, but at the beginning for organizing it. She's the manager of the Gildenhorn Institute. The Gildenhorn Institute, as we call it, GIIS, is one of the largest Israel Studies institutes, centers at a university in the United States. The Institute publishes Israel Studies Review, which is an important professional journal in the field. The subject of today's book talk by Ken Stern, which I'll mention a little bit more about in just a second, is about the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian issue as it plays out on campuses. I like to say, borrowing both the Jewish and the Hebrew phrase, that at the University of Maryland, where we all teach and work, there is, for the most part, shalom bayit. There's peace for the most part on campus. And that itself is the subject of a whole other hour, which we won't talk about today. But I think the shalom bayit that we have at the university is largely a testament to those who teach and work on these issues, including Professor Sham and Yoram Perry, who's the outgoing and the founding director of the Gildenhorn Institute. Our program today is also co-sponsored by the mothership of the Gildenhorn Institute, which is the Jewish Studies Department at the university, known as the Meyerhoff Center, which is currently chaired by Professor Chaim Lappin. I want to thank everyone. We've got people from our area, DC, and all around the world tapping in, which is nice. Today's book talk is a book simply called The Conflict Over the Conflict by Ken Stern. I'm not going to read his resume. I'll just give a few highlights. My colleague made a joke about how people read resumes. It's a bit off color, so I won't share the joke, but I'm going to do it just in the highlights reel form. Ken has worked for many, many years on issues of human rights, academic freedom, anti-hate. He worked at the American Jewish Committee for many years. He's currently the head of the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. Previously, he also worked at the Justice and Karen Rosenberg Foundation. His long experience working with universities, academics, with communities, and with university administrators. We're delighted to have him. This brand new book, it's fresh. It's a brand new book. It's on a subject, I just wanted to say that I think when it mostly comes up for a lot of us, it's very dichotomous. It's us and them. It's right versus wrong. It often comes up in very conflictual and combative terms. Sometimes it comes up because others from outside of our universities are being opportunistic. We can name names later if anybody wants in the talk and in the question and answer period. There's a lot of opportunism. And at the end of the day, for a lot of us, I didn't say this to you earlier, Ken, but for a lot of us, this is just a crisis, a moment. In Yiddish, you'd say a gewalt. It sort of pops up in the world of people who teach and have administrative roles at universities, particularly those who teach and do research on Israel and Israel-related issues, but it's not something we focus on. It either ruins a particular weekend because of a crisis chain of emails at the University of Maryland, despite this shalom bayit that I talked about before. We had an episode with a BDS resolution that happened during Passover and part of the spring break of the university last year. It's actually a footnote in your book. But we rarely sit and think about it methodically. And what I love about your book, and I'm delighted that you're joining us today, is that you dissect the issue, you offer some diagnoses, and in that last chapter, chapter 8, you offer a blueprint, a very practical blueprint for how to address it. And all of it unfolds over 200 pages that are deeply personal, which makes the book, for me, very gripping. So before I turn it over to Ken, I just want to say to those who are joining us today, I'll give you a quick run of show. Ken's going to give a quick tour to Horizon. He's going to sort of run through the book, highlight some of his main arguments for 20, 25 minutes. We'll spend the rest of our time together, 45 minutes or so, doing Q&A. We're going to take both formats of questions and comments. Comments are also welcome as well. We'll take both live. My colleague Avis or myself will unmute participants, and you can ask. I'll kind of keep a track and keep an order. But if others want to, partly because of the platform of Zoom, if you want to just add into the chat, either to me, Scott, personally, or to everyone, if you want to type in a question, I'll also collect them and share them back and forth with Ken. So either live, face-to-face as it is on Zoom, or sending me your questions. We're also recording. I want to mention that we're recording today's program so that we can post it and share it with those who couldn't participate. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken. Avis, if you can unmute him. And Ken, the floor is yours.
It's okay. Thank you very much for that very kind and generous introduction, Scott. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you, Avis, for making this happen. And Paul, as always, you were very instrumental for the production of this book and for my thinking over a number of years. I want to thank you especially. So as Scott mentioned, I'm going to be talking for about 20-25 minutes, and then I look forward to whatever direction the questions and answers take us. But the issues here really are difficult about how do we think about this conflict? How do we approach it on a campus? How do we have rational discussions about it? And really at its basis, why it's so difficult sometimes to do so. And some of the things that I have in the book and that I'm going to talk about are not limited to discussions of Israel-Palestine. They're also relevant to how we think about other hot button issues. So what I want to do, as Scott mentioned, the book is somewhat personal. I am going to go through a couple of those stories along the way so that you can see, through my eyes, at least some of the basic principles and best practices that I think are important as we think about the conflict over the conflict. And where I want to begin is really where I began the book with, because even though it's not a campus example, it gives a really sharp definition to what the difficulties are. So those of you that are old enough to remember, back in the 80s and 90s up to the early 2000s, there was a significant neo-Nazi group in the Idaho Panhandle called the Aryan Nations. And they were the source of a lot of anti-Semitism, white supremacy, and terrorism. Those of you old enough to remember, Alan Berg was a Jewish talk radio host and was assassinated by a group that came out of the Aryan Nations. Buford Furrow was an Aryan Nations member who shot up the JCC in Los Angeles in 1999. There was a pipe bomb of newspapers and Planned Parenthood and of a priest who spoke out against the Aryan Nations in that area. And if you were living in Spokane, which was right next door, it impacted you too. I remember conversations with Jewish folks in that community who would go into stores and find razor blades stuck into Hanukkah gift wrap and things like that. So it was a real, tremendous problem. And the Aryan Nations got shut down in 2001 after a lawsuit by the Southern Poverty Law Center. But for years, the bulk of the work against them, not exclusively, but predominantly, came from two groups in the Spokane area in particular. And that was the people associated with the Jewish community and with the peace and justice groups, particularly the Peace and Justice Action League in Spokane. And even after the Aryan Nations disbanded, the danger was, still clear to everybody who had participated in pushing back against them. Some of you may remember a few years ago, there was a Martin Luther King Day parade, and the police, thank God, found a radio-controlled backpack that was filled with fishing weights soaked in the anticoagulant found in rat poison. If it had gone off, kids were in that march, it would have been a devastation. So the danger is real. But for 8 years, the Jewish community and the Peace and Justice group did not talk to each other. They would not be in the same coalitions with each other. They would not even be in the same room with each other. And what was the issue? The issue was that the Peace and Justice group had a static page on its website supporting boycotts, divestments, and sanctions against Israel. So the Jewish community was basically saying this is anti-Semitic. The Peace and Justice group were saying, no, it isn't. And neither group was going to solve the Middle East conflict, but both groups had a lot at stake in their own communities. And they got to the point where they realized that this was nuts. And they had to figure out a vocabulary to have a conversation even where they had stark differences. So that's where I start the book, and that's where I end the book, and that's where I'll end the talk there as well. So very briefly, in terms of my background, I grew up in the 50s and 60s in New York City, very involved as a teenager in civil rights and anti-Vietnam War work. I moved to Portland, Oregon in the 70s for law school, and then became a lawyer there, and was very involved in the progressive community. I represented one of the, as a criminal defense lawyer, represented one of the co-founders of the American Indian movement. I represented some of the last Vietnam era protesters, the homeless community, and so forth. So I was very involved in the progressive community in Portland. And Portland then is now also had this other side. It had the right-wing extremists, the white supremacists. There was a group called the Posse Comitatus that was a precursor to the 90s militia that used to hand out anti-Semitic tracts in the courthouse steps about Jewish conspiracy and so forth. And the reason why I mention that is that in '82, when the Lebanon war started, I was part of the protests against the Lebanon war. I thought it was ill-advised, but I started seeing from some of my colleagues in the left some tropes about Israel and Jews that were very familiar to what I had seen handed out by the Posse Comitatus. Jews controlling the media, Jews controlling this, Jews controlling that. And it was a difficult time, and I was struggling of how to deal with that. I was writing op-eds, but they were mostly self-righteous, I think, and they were angry, and people were talking past each other. And in some ways, the book, Scott was asking me before we came live, why I wrote it. Part of it was because I've been struggling for 40 years, really about how to have conversations about this that are rational, as opposed to going into the us versus them box. So. Flip forward a couple of years, as Scott mentioned, I went to the American Jewish Committee as their anti-Semitism expert in 2014, and part of my remit was to look at the campus, and not just anti-Semitism, A, because we were concerned with more than just Jews, and B, because when you're talking about a campus and what to do about any issue of bigotry, it's important to talk about mechanisms that focus on the campus and what to do about all types of bigotry. So it has to address racism, it has to address sexism, homophobia, and so forth. And one of the first projects I did in the early 90s was looking at how colleges should handle bigotry on campus. I went to archive, talked to lots of deans and professors and college presidents and so forth, and put out a report and trained about a couple hundred college presidents about how do you deal with issues of bigotry on campus. And some may remember that this was the period of time where the go-to remedy that people were talking about was hate speech codes. The University of Michigan had a famous one. But the idea was, let's have certain rules that prohibit certain types of speech on campus. And the report I put together rejected that. And one of the basic principles is one of the things I want to get across today. There are lots of reasons why these hate speech codes were not wise or effective. But one I would like to highlight is that they gave people something to do that distracted them from the things that would actually matter, that were actually more difficult to do and maybe more expensive to do, but more important to do. Things like surveys and looking at the courses and training staff and so forth. All those things disappeared from the agenda when people talked about there's certain rules that one has to follow in terms of speech. And what I learned from going through that process and putting that report together and doing the training is that when you're dealing with any sort of conflict on campus that has to deal with questions about potential bigotry, that free speech and academic freedom have to be at the cornerstone of what you're doing. If you're suggesting things that either write them off or diminish them, they're not effective for the campus. They're going to harm the academy. And if you want things that are going to be aligned with the values of the campus, they have to be things that promote free speech and academic freedom. That doesn't mean you don't disagree with speech that you disagree with, but it means that you have to create an environment in which those things are valued. So let me flip forward a little bit too. So the year 2000, the Second Intifada, starts the Durban Conference, World Conference Against Racism, which was an anti-Semitic and anti-Israel orgy, happened in 2001. And in 2002, we started seeing petitions on campus that were talking about divestment from things related to Israel. Let me just make a quick segue, and then I'll get back to this 2002 period. So I want to point out, just to have some perspective for this conversation, and this is a good point to do it. First divestment petition started in 2002, where 18 years later, zero have passed. No college has divested from Israel. Most campuses, although people try to create this image of this a ubiquitous problem with anti-Israel stuff on campus, most campuses, Israel is not an issue. There are about 4,000 campuses across the United States. In a recent year, 149 had anti-Israel programs. And if you look at the number of pro-Israel programs on campus compared to anti-Israel ones, the pro-Israel ones outnumber it 2 to 1. And then if you look at a third metric, which is disruptions, which I find deplorable against academic freedom. You can protest a speaker, you shouldn't shut them down from speaking. But the numbers are small. Between 2010 and 2019, there were 117 disruptions, and all those cases, 16 were total, were not be able to be completed, the rest were. So just to put that into the context, so that this all started in 2002. But we did see some things in 2002 that were problematic. There was an attack on the Hillel building at Berkeley. There was a riot when Benjamin Netanyahu spoke in Concordia in Montreal. And what I did at AJC was working with a bunch of college presidents. They put out a statement deploring these types of attacks. And what was the cornerstone of that statement that got 400 college presidents to sign on? It was the support of academic freedom. It said that our job as college presidents is to ensure that a campus is a place that doesn't have harassment and intimidation and is open to ideas. Flip forward again 5 more years. You may remember that the University and College Union in the United Kingdom passed a resolution promoting an academic boycott of Israel. The Anti-Defamation League's reaction in the US was to say, well, let's consider doing a counter boycott of British academics. Well, aside from the fact that that gives away the best argument, academic boycotts are anathema, we should look at ideas in the academy based on the merits of the ideas, not on the nationality of who the academics are associated with. It would have been a disaster on so many levels. And I tell the story in the book about how Lee Bollinger, the president of Columbia, put forward a statement that I helped get ads, in the New York Times with over 400 college presidents on this one too. But the basic premise of the statement that he put out was, if the UCU was going to do this ill-advised step and divide the academic world into 2, Israelis who should be shunned and everyone else, count Columbia as an Israeli institution. 400 other American institutions do the same thing. I guarantee you, if there had been a resolution that wanted to get presidents to sign on that said, we're going to boycott British academics, no. But to substantiate and underscore the importance of academic freedom, that was important. So again, academic freedom is a cornerstone of a lot of the strategies of how to think about Israel and Palestine on campus. I'm going to segue for a couple of minutes into something that, because I know people are interested about the executive order, and I have a whole chapter that leads up to that in the book too, and I want to give this audience a little bit more of a background to that and some of the issues with it. Basically the backstory is that, again, after the Intifada started, there was a group called the EUMC, the European Monitoring Center on Xenophobia, Racism, and Related Intolerance, that had the task of cataloging anti-Semitic incidents across Europe. And it put out a report in 2004, and there were 2 things noticeable about how it was describing what its job was. One is it correctly said, look, we have a problem here. There are so many different countries, there's no standard definition of anti-Semitism. People in Bratislavia and Kiev and Paris, don't know really what to look for. How could we, combine things in a way that's reasonable, that people are looking at the same things in our report? And the second thing, to me, was a real sort of political sidestep. What they figured is, okay, let's do a definition that looks at anti-Semitism as a series of stereotypes about Jews. Intellectual problems with that aside, what they wanted to do, in my estimation, was deal with a potential situation where a Jew on the streets of Paris was attacked as a stand-in for an Israeli. So they said if the person had these views about Jews, transferred them to Israelis, and retransferred them back to the Jew in front of them in Paris, that was anti-Semitism, but not if they were beat up the Jew because they were upset at Israeli politics. Well, to me, that made no more sense than the idea that if somebody lynched a black person in the 60s or the 50s in the South because they thought blacks were shiftless and lazy, that was racism. But if they were upset in a Martin Luther King speech, that was not racism, the same result. So that started a discussion about how the definition might be used, new definition for the EUMC. And in fact, as those discussions were starting, a Jewish school in Montreal was firebombed in reaction to the assassination of a Hamas leader. So not anti-Semitism by the old definition, by the new definition, yeah. It wasn't perfect. I was the lead drafter of it. There were many others involved, but it gave some guideposts. It took away looking at some of the, trying to psychoanalyze the actors and to really look objectively at whether people were being targeted because they were Jewish or connected with Jews. And it did have, and I thought it was important, and I still do, some examples related to Israel, holding all Jews collectively responsible for the actions of Israel, Nazi equivalents, and the statement that Jews do not have self-determination, anti-Zionism in the sense of Zionism is a racist enterprise. And the reason for that is when we saw those expressions in Europe, they sort of correlated with the attacks that we were seeing on individuals. So if we're keeping the temperature across time and across borders, those were important things for monitors to keep an eye on. So that's the sort of backstory of the definition, which is now called the IRA definition. So keep that thought in mind. I'm going to talk about one other thing in the United States, and I'll blend them together. In 2010, there was the Department of Education put forth what's called the Dear Colleague letter. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act applies to education on campus about harassment or different treatment in pervasive environments that made it basically impossible to study. And they said, even though religion isn't a category, Jews and Sikhs and Muslims as ethnicities are protected. So you could now use this remedy, which was great because if somebody was violating Title VI in theory, they could lose all federal funding. And I, in fact, used it for Jewish high school students in Binghamton area who were victimized by a Kick a Jew Day and swastikas put on their desks, and the school district did nothing. And this was a useful tool to force them to take it seriously. But what happened starting in 2010 and 11 is some groups on the Jewish right had this bright idea, oh, let's take this new power under the Department of Education's letter under Title VI and marry it to the definition. So now we're going to say when there are expressions on campus that violate the definition, that can serve as part of the basis of a Title VI complaint. So you started seeing some of these cases coming up. There were plenty about programs about the occupation, about texts that teachers were using that they thought were one-sided and not ambiguously, not ambiguously, even-handed when it came to Israel. They complained about a program called Understanding Gaza, saying it was one-sided and anti-Israel. And they said Jewish students felt, quote, emotionally and intellectually threatened. They complained in a complaint about a program called Arabs in the Holocaust, which claimed the creation of Israel was a tragedy for Arabs. Complained about speakers, films, and so forth. All these lawsuits under Title VI failed. Then these groups on the Jewish right figured, okay, let's go try to change the law. And they went to promote what was called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act. And when that failed, they got Donald Trump to sign an executive order, which basically says, in looking at one of these complaints, you have to consider this definition. In the testimony against the legislation, it was worth noting that Jewish studies professors, the president of the Association of Jewish Studies, other academics, the President of America, Penn, and so forth, were speaking out against this. Groups on the Jewish right, including the Simon Wiesenthal Center, were speaking out for it, and the Simon Wiesenthal even applauded the application of the definition in the UK that stopped an Israel Apartheid Week program. I'm no great fan of Israel Apartheid Week, as you might imagine, but it's protected speech. And they said other campuses across the globe should prohibit these too. So what's the harm of this? Again, thinking of academic freedom as a cornerstone of this. I'm not worried about the individual cases so much, although I am. I'm worried about administrators in universities. One of their jobs is to protect the university from being sued. And if they know that there are folks that are going to hunt for speech that they say violates the definition to use as a linchpin of a Title VI case, they're either going to try to suppress that speech or they're going to at least condemn it and really skew the debate on campus. And faculty, why, if they know that other groups are hunting for what's in their syllabus, what they teach in class, who the speakers are, what the programs they do, why would you teach about this rather than something else where you're not going to be in the crosshairs? The other problem with this approach is that it propels the idea that Jewish students should be protected from hearing expressions of things about Israel that might disturb them. They're somehow inherently fragile. And to me, that's one of the great tragedies of this whole debate, and it goes beyond Israel-Palestine. But it seems to me, as somebody who's involved in college, just sent 2 kids a few years ago and spent a lot of money to get them educated, if students are not disturbed by ideas on a college campus, it's a wasted experience. You're going to be disturbed by ideas for the rest of your life. If you can't be in that environment and test out ideas and be wrong and think about how you think about them, it's a waste. To say that students should be ostriches is just, to me, a dereliction of what a campus should be about. So one of the things I did in the book, I'm going to go over this very, very briefly here, but I thought it's important to have discussions about these issues. It's important for people to be aware about how they think about hot button issues like this. And the first chapter is called Thinking About Thinking, about why and how people are disturbed by ideas that put in the paradigm of us versus them, and how our thinking is influenced when our ideas are tethered to an issue of identity and perceived social justice and injustice. A lot of this is drawn from my day job in directing a center on hate studies. But what we know from that, from the various different component fields about how we think about us versus them, especially when there's a perception of conflict, is really important to keep in mind when we're thinking about how we think about this conflict. So very briefly, there's brain science that shows that different parts of the brain fire differently. For example, when we're showed pictures of people of our own race and people of a different race, people that we're agnostic towards and people that we hate. Just how we're wired to see an us versus them and this differently. There's evolutionary psychology. There's the Journal of Hate Studies, there's a landmark piece by Jim Waller, who's a genocide Holocaust expert at King College. But he was really talking about how human brains evolved over millennia. And remember, our brains are really old. And we were living at a place where we were worried about the people over the next hill and what they might do to us. And there are aspects of that that incorporate how we feel and how we think. All of us, if we think rationally, should be more afraid of automobiles than spiders or snakes, because automobiles are more likely to kill us. I don't know about you, but at least me, I have more of a visceral reaction to a spider and a snake than I do to a 57 Buick. So, there are things like that to incorporate. Social psychology, we could take this group, I could flip a coin, divide it into 2 groups, A and B. Everybody knows it's totally random. But after group identities are formed, each group will think it's better, it's smarter, it's more attractive, and so forth. And there's a lot of emerging social science that talks about when we're in these bubbles of identity, we really strive for simplicity and certainty. And that, I think, reflects a lot of the debate about Israel-Palestine too. So I think as we're aware of this more, that the us versus them, what happens to our thinking, it opens up the possibility to having more intelligent discussions. And I quote in the book Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist who talks about moral psychology. And one of his basic points is that morality, and a lot of the discussion about Israel-Palestine is put in moral terms, both blinds, it limits to what you can think, and it binds. It makes people feel connected and they're part of a team beating up on the other side. Other things associated with it too, symbols, the power of symbols. I mean, we see that today in the whole debate about Confederate flags and Confederate statues. And I have lots of examples in the book about symbols too. The Israeli flag being torn down by pro-Palestinian protesters and being absolutely draped over the shoulders by pro-Israel folks. So symbols all play into this too. So I think a deep dive into how do we think and feel, again, when our identity is tethered to an issue of perceived social justice and social injustice is really important. And it will help sort of repel some of the black and white thinking. I mean, I have in the book so many examples of each side calling the other side Nazis and refusing to sit down and have a discussion. The campus ought to actually be the ideal environment to have these difficult discussions if we structure it correctly and we talk about what the campus ought to be. If we reject the idea that we're going to censor others because they have a different point of view, their Nazi equivalents, who wouldn't have a discussion with a Nazi. The pro-Palestinian folks tend to do it sometimes by, as I mentioned, disruptions and academic boycotts. The pro-Israel side by now laws and emails and phone calls, but the idea to censor the other side, to me, undercuts what a campus should be. So what do you do? I think one thing is you have to push the embracement of complexity, and I do want to take a minute just to read you a short snippet of what I use when I do programs on campus about this, just so that you can see, an example of what I'm talking about concretely. So bear with me for reading a few paragraphs. I wrote, consider again the claim that Israelis are settler colonialists. On July 4th, 2018, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel wrote to the Iroquois Confederacy, Native nations from New York and Canada, urging them to boycott the World Championship of Lacrosse, a game natives invented and that the Iroquois introduced to early American settlers, a game they continue to excel at, and that's important to their culture. The request stated in part, as indigenous peoples, we have both seen our traditional lands colonized, our people ethnically cleansed and massacred by colonial settlers. This year marks 70 years of Israeli disposition of Palestinians, which began with what we call the Nakba, or catastrophe, in the years surrounding Israel's establishment on our homeland in 1948. Pre- and post-state Israeli forces premeditatively drove out the majority of the indigenous people of Palestine and destroyed more than 500 of our villages and towns. And then I wrote, contrast this language with the passage of an essay by Judea Pearl, a noted academic and the father of Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter, who was beheaded by terrorists in Pakistan in 2002. It is not surprising, Pearl wrote, that misrepresenting Israel as a white settler colonialist society has become a cornerstone of BDS ideology and propaganda. And he asked those who read such claims to, quote, ask themselves if they could recall any of the following. One case of white settlers moving into a country they perceive to be the birthplace of their history. One case of white settlers speaking a language spoken in the land before the language spoken by its contemporary residents. One case of settlers whose holidays commemorated the historical events in the land to which they moved, not the lands from which they came. One case of settlers who did not name towns like New York, New Amsterdam, and New Wales. Israeli towns are not named New Warsaw, New Berlin, and New Baghdad, but after names by which those towns were known in ancient times. One case of settlers who narrated their homecoming journey for 80 generations in poetry, prose, lore, and daily prayers. And I write, the reality is that Israel isn't like settler colonial states in many ways, but in other ways it is. Proponents on each side seem blind to the complexities, choosing to highlight either the differences or similarities depending on which better suits their black-white, good, bad, us-them argument, or perhaps as Michael Hogg and his colleagues posit, depending on which makes them feel more certain. A scholar, Zeth Anziska, says, quote, real history is the ability to navigate all these views at once. The rest is communal advocacy. So what do we do trying to create the opportunity to have those discussions and seeing that complexity? So, and here's where I'm going to end. some practical suggestions. In addition to finding ways to promote those types of couplets, we have to teach classes on anti-Semitism. When I have done that at Bar, by the time we get to Israel-Palestine 2/3 of the way in, it's a lot easier conversation, even though people have stark differences. I think it's important for students on campus to understand the value of free speech and academic freedom. I think it's important to underscore the campus as a model place for difficult discussions and not just having views that come in, quote, the correct ones. I think it's important to insist on functional empathy. Imagine how you would feel, just have the imagination to feel how you would feel differently if you were born in different circumstances. I mean, we're seeing some of that with white folks supporting the Black Lives Matter protest today, but it's something we need to do more and should be part of a challenge in education. And then we should reject, I think, the sort of strident us versus them that we see on both sides of this that try to censor the other, the anti-normalization on the pro-Palestinian side. We're not even going to have a discussion, and the Hillel guidelines that say we're not going to have in our umbrella even people we fundamentally disagree with, but are important in the context of the discussion about contemporary Israel. I think it's also important for outside groups to model some of this if we want to see it on campus. I spoke at the Academic Engagement Network webinar yesterday, and I challenged them. I said, why not bring in somebody like Rashid Khalidi or another Palestinian with whom you fundamentally disagree, and hear their views firsthand rather than just create this sort of cartoonish, here's why we think BDS is bad. Hear their views and challenge those groups to bring in people like Jonathan Greenblatt and David Harris in their pro-Palestinian organizations. You may not disagree, your blood pressure may go up, decorum may be something that you have to enforce, but you'll at least be able to engage ideas rather than just to vilify them, put them off and be blind to them. On campus, there are opportunities here for classes, and that's one of the things I want to thank Paul for. He was instrumental in this. We're both part of this group called the Alliance for Academic Freedom. And a few years ago, there was somebody posted an article about this young woman named Amna Faruqi, who's a Pakistani Muslim, who became the student president of J Street, which, whatever you think of J Street, it's a Zionist organization. Pakistani Muslim, head of a Zionist organization. That's a little odd. Paul, when I asked questions about it, said, yeah, she was a great student. She was in my class. What was the class? Well, the class was looking at the conflict from the Israel-Palestine, Israel-Arab conflict from the 1880s until the 1930s. Before the Holocaust, before 48, before 67, before contemporary things, so the guts of the conflict. And it was focused on the Peel Commission of 36, 37. And it was a simulation. Students had to adopt a character that was a participant when the Brits sent Lord Peel to talk to Jews and Arabs and what the heck do we do here, had to faithfully represent, research and faithfully represent one of the participants. And Amna spent, a number of weeks in the skin of David Ben-Gurion. And when I spoke to her, she said, you think that was weird? I had an Israeli classmate who had to be a mufti, and as much of a pain in the butt as he was, the person on my side who was the Jabotinsky character was even more troublesome. So, Paul connected me with this woman named Natasha Gill, who had actually designed this and has taught it. And it's a great model. And she told me that when students came into the class, they came in saying, oh, this is exciting. We're going to figure out how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the Israeli-Arab conflict should have been solved. And they come out of the class saying, now we know why it hasn't been solved 80 years afterwards. And that's precisely what you want education to do. Students may still be strong proponents of one side or the other, but to really understand as if they were in a different circumstance, what the other side's arguments are, rather than just saying at the top it's bad, it's evil, it's rejected. That's what education should do. So it'll also create the capacity for critical thinking. And finally, let me just loop back to where I said I would end up in Spokane, because it's actually a very encouraging story and it can be replicated on campus. People there did want to find a way forward. So there were about 40 people that were specifically invited. I had them do 80 pages of text study. They had to agree this was an open and honest conversation. Nobody was going to be demonized. Everybody had to say what they thought, and they had to be engaged. And I started out, of course, with a lot of the material that I talked about the Thinking About Thinking chapter from Hate Studies, to open up the capacity for people to reflect on why they were thinking what they were thinking. At the end of and people are still having discussions, by the way, and I'll open up some things inside the Jewish community too, which I can talk about as well. But I was impressed at the end of the day, one of the pro-BDS people came up to me and said, now I get it. I never really understood the Jewish history and Jews being boycotted, and why the idea of boycott in relation to Israel rankles so viscerally to so many Jews. And there was somebody there who was a very strident AIPAC supporter, who came up to me and said he was thinking about something that I said. I had talked about that I was debating a pro-Palestinian, actually a Palestinian academic who was promoting BDS. And I said, as much as I disagree with BDS, he did have a point that had to be thought about, which was that at the Second Intifada, people were saying, find a nonviolent way to make your case. And whatever you think about BDS, it's nonviolent. So it can open up thinking. I've done it on campus too. If people have a will, there's a way sometimes it has to be off the record discussions. But I think that this is a perfect topic for the type of critical thinking we ought to insist that campuses provide students and its community. So with there, I'll stop.
Thank you, Ken. It's a great place to end. For those who want to buy the book or are thinking about the book or already have the book, page 181 to 182 is where the Amna Faruqi and the UMD case comes up, and Paul Sham from the Gildenhorn Institute. So flip ahead to those pages if you'd like. I'm going to just make a few quick comments and then turn to questions. I already have a few. One first from Paul, Sahar, and I think there's some others in the queue. Number one, I just want to abuse the role for just a minute to thank you. I think you're in the book, but also in this program today, emphasis on academic freedom and free speech as a baseline is very important. It's something I think a lot of us are grasping onto. Your emphasis on inclusion, not exclusion. In particular, there's an anecdote you tell in the book about Ken Marcus and another speaker and analogies to Holocaust deniers that you don't think really fit. So inclusion over exclusion, another baseline, very important. What you said I didn't see it in the book yet, I haven't read the entire book, but what you said earlier about this perception of the fragility of Jewish students, which informs a lot of the thinking, sometimes of funders or other outside stakeholders, really isn't, not only is it incorrect, it doesn't do them much service. And I can just attest, teaching in 2018, 2019, and into 2020 online, I teach courses only on Jewish politics and on Israel. And though there's no single majority cohort in any of my courses, students are drawn from different religious, ethnic, and other backgrounds, but there has consistently been a cohort of Jewish or modern Orthodox students that are desperate for the complexity that you're talking about. So thank you for that. And one more thing, I just want to say, you referenced it briefly here. I think you were too modest, Ken. The contributions you made to the discourse on the IRA definitions, in particular, some interviews you gave back in December and January in the media, I think were really important contributions to the public and policy discourse, relevant to the campus, but far beyond too. So I just wanted to say that, in addition to the other compliments before we barrage you with harder questions. And I'll also say, for the Gildenhorn Institute and the Jewish Studies Department at the University of Maryland, it's probably the first time a 57 Buick has ever been mentioned. So I thank you. First, let me just throw out a question from Paul Sham. He asked about the moment we're in now, the summer of 2020, the movement against racism, the mass demonstrations. Are you surprised that there hasn't been a particularly noticeable Arab-Israeli or Israeli-Palestinian component? And if so, why? And third, do you think that will last?
Well, Paul, just so that I understand the question, are you saying, component related to the campus? Or
first, I was going to add both writ large in society, and then the third part of his question, will it last, kind of flows to the campus, because it's unfolded in the summer when universities are, but will it last means, do you foresee it coming into fall 2020 on the campus?
Well, I think we're in a very unusual moment. The pandemic, the reaction to the George Floyd, killing, and we don't know where we're going to be, right? And the presidential election, and one of the things which I didn't talk about here, but I've talked about in other places, including one of the op-ed pieces that you mentioned about the role of leadership in dealing with the issues of anti-Semitism, and why white supremacists feel empowered. And I think they're getting messages that they see as supporting their point of view. So that's part of it too. I'm encouraged by the protests. I'm encouraged by the diversity of the protests. I'm encouraged by the focus on it. But those of us who've lived long enough through other moments know that sometimes it's just a moment, and sometimes it could be a movement, and there are lots of variables to ascertain whether that's going to be. I did a webinar for the Bard Center for the Study of Hate. And by the way, if anybody wants to be part of our, to be on the webinar list, I'm sure Scott will send an email, put my email, and you could, email me and I'll invite you to be part of it. I did one with somebody who was teaching about 1968, who's a professor, lives in Minneapolis, as things were unfolding there. And there are potential lessons, and there are potential things that may be different there. So we're certainly at a point of turmoil. How is it going to come out? A lot of it we may look back at this as all sort of a footnote to what happens in the 2020 election. Not only who wins, but whether if Trump loses, whether he's going to say it was illegitimate, and the impact of that, and how people who see, sort of holding on to what they perceive as a white birthright in America might feel disempowered in the aftermath. I mean, there were some of us who were writing years ago, and we were totally wrong, but looking at the implications of the militia movement as it was falling apart, and then the Tea Party, whether there was a moment, in the 2016 election, we sort of figured if Hillary won, would these folks who would try to organize politically and who would go pick up guns? We may have that moment in 2020. May have been wrong about the timing, but maybe right about the fear. And I think those things may become the top item. Where Israel-Palestine is going to fit into this, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the things we haven't talked about is the possibility of annexation and what that will do in terms of the discourse. Part of it, again, is what you're talking about, is what life's going to be on campus. Are students going to be there? Are they not? Are they going to be focusing on what happens in the election and organizing against systemic racism or other things? I mean, honestly, we don't know. It's all possible. I'm encouraged by some of what, a lot of what I've seen in reaction to the murders, but I think it's still too early to tell.
Good, thanks. Can I call on Professor Sahar Khamis? I'll give you the floor. And if others want to just note there's a little hand raise icon, or I'm taking some other questions via the chat feature. So please feel free. Sahar.
Thank you so much. My name is Sahar Khamis. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm also an affiliate professor of women's studies and with the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity. Let me first thank you so much for this excellent presentation. I wish we have more of these very vibrant and important discussions on a lot of our campuses in the US and elsewhere. I'm personally in a very blessed position for two reasons. Number one, I'm a very active member of the interfaith movement. So I have a lot of Muslim, Christian, Jewish friends and friends from other, racial, ethnic, and faith traditions. So I do appreciate diversity and I embrace diversity. And I'm also blessed to be a part of the University of Maryland campus, where we have a very vibrant, active, both Palestinian and Israeli groups. And at the same time, we have a lot of very vibrant and important discussions, including discussions organized by Center for Israel Studies, which did not shy away from inviting different participants and speakers with different views. However, this blessed position is not widely shared by a lot of my Arab friends, unfortunately. Many of them still feel that university campuses are not always welcoming of open speech, especially around the conflict or around very conflicting and different views, contentious views around the conflict, especially when you talk about Israel-Palestine. So much so that some of them feel, and I think you pointed out this in your talk, that if we touch upon issues related to Israel-Palestine, that can be a very inflammatory issue. So much so that one friend said, oh no, we don't want to talk about this issue because, quote unquote, I just quote her, criticizing Israel can be a career killer. She literally said that, and I was like, wow. So I think we have a lot of work that needs to be done. Number one, to come up with clear definitions of what really constitutes hate speech versus free speech, what is really Islamophobia, what is really anti-Semitism. To me, it seems like a lot of these border lines are still very blurry and very much unclear and very fuzzy. I don't believe, for example, that if you criticize an Israeli policy, that makes you anti-Semitic. But many people would think otherwise. And many people are confused as to where these boundaries start and where they stop. So a lot of work needs to unpack some of these definitions and to clarify them. And that's the work that we academics have to do. This is point number one. Point number two, I totally agree with you that we should not have any kind of banning on free speech on university campuses. As I said, University of Maryland has an excellent environment. That is not necessarily the case everywhere. So, when you hear about, this ban or this, constraint on free speech, or like you said, issues of disruption or otherwise, it really breaks my heart because it deprives our students from the experience they need to get on college campuses to become smarter and to become more open to the world. So we, again, have a lot of work to do to protect free speech on college campuses, to make our students smarter and more prepared to face the world in a more effective way. Number three, I feel like we conflate a lot the political with the personal and the human. Like, I have friends who have different political views. We don't always agree on everything, but we remain friends. I have a friend who has, strong Zionist views. We disagreed on some issues, in his home, and we still remain friends up till now. We should learn how to accept the other rather than stigmatizing and labeling, attaching labels and stigma. Like when you said, oh, all Jews should be responsible for, Israeli action. This is like a misperception, which is unfortunately very common. So, all Arabs or Muslims are responsible for this terrorist attack or that action that we don't like. Again, all of these issues need a lot of work on our part as activists, as academics, as scholars, as teachers, as parents, you name it. Finally, I just want to end on a positive note that I think that among our challenges comes a lot of good blessings and good opportunities. There has been an unprecedented surge in Islamophobia and anti-Semitism recently. We have seen this horrific attacks on both Muslims and Jews worldwide, which sometimes did not just stop at the level of hate speech. Unfortunately, translated into actual actions against mosques, synagogues, killing innocent people, losing innocent lives. As part of the interfaith movement, I think we have a golden opportunity as Jews and Muslims to bring these issues up in our interfaith circles, but also on college campuses. I was going to organize an event last semester, which unfortunately did not happen because of the coronavirus and the campus closure, that was going to be about Jews and Muslims working together to combat and to fight Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. Now that we have the Zoom platform, I think I'm going to probably think about doing it virtually in the fall semester. And I think we need to have more of these efforts and these discussions, both on the grounds and online, in order to stand together and show a different, version, a different reality, that we, instead of being perceived as quote unquote enemies, how can we work as allies? Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. And I fundamentally agree with you that it's important to find ways to have difficult conversations and to find alliances and so forth. Your point about some people being afraid to teach what they want to or say what they want to for fear of being beaten up. Yeah, that to me is a real horror, and it's happening on both sides. As I put, I put more detail in the book, but basically there's a pressure on both sides to not say what you think and not to teach in engaging ways about this because you're afraid of what's going to happen. There are people who are afraid that the some pro-Israel Jewish groups are going to go beat up a professor for saying something again, in the context of the definition. But there are also some academics who are, pro-Zionist, especially younger ones without tenure, who I know are afraid of saying things too, because they're afraid they're going to get from students and others, their colleagues in the faculty beat up too. And I think it's, it's important in an environment for faculty in particular to establish that we should have as you were talking about, fundamental different views, but an ability to communicate across it. I think that's really important. And one of the things that it's another theme in my book is that I think it's an obligation for people to speak out when they see people that there are political opponents being blacklisted. There's blacklists on both sides. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important when you see people that have your basic point of view about the conflict are blacklisting people on the other side. That's your obligation to speak out and say no. I may disagree with that point of view, but this person has the right to articulate it. We can talk about why we disagree, why we may disagree fundamentally, but to say that person should not have the capacity or should be forced to be fearful to say what they think as opposed to defend it on a campus or outside the campus is entirely wrong. One of the things I would disagree with you on, and this is, again, a minor matter, but just to put it in context, I don't like the idea of there's a hate speech versus non-hate speech. There's hateful speech. That ought to be opposed. It ought to be exposed. It ought to be really examined on a campus. But lots of time people, and I don't know if you were using it this way, but a lot of time people use it to suggest, well, there's hateful speech that's not otherwise First Amendment protected. It is, hateful speech is First Amendment protected. What isn't protected is the sort of emergency situations where that speech or expression might lead to harassment or intimidation. I could say I think all fill in the blank should be killed.
Yeah, that's what
I can't say that pointing to a group of black people or Muslim people or women or whatever, Jews across the street, and my bunch of guys here are baseball bats. That's probably not protected. Mm-hmm. So that's to me a difference. So it isn't a question of having definitions of where we're going to say what's acceptable, but what isn't. But on a campus, especially saying, okay, here are the problems with this speech, why I disagree with it. But it's important to be heard. And one of the things I had in the book is that you may remember when Ahmadinejad came and spoke at Columbia. There's a lot of people in the Jewish community. How can you do that? You're using money, you're endorsing his views, you're giving him a platform. He's homophobic, he's sexist, he's anti-Semitic, he wants to wipe Israel off the map. How can you do that? And I supported Bollinger because he was invited, Ahmadinejad was, properly through the right channels, but I also insisted that, he didn't need my pushing, but that he had to speak out and say why he found Ahmadinejad's views reprehensible. And he did that in that context, and he did it very forcefully. And the point is that, we could wish away people like Ahmadinejad. We could wish away people that have racist and sexist and anti-Semitic and Islamophobic views, but they are not one-offs. They're people that represent others. And on a campus, if you can create the environment in which you're making it clear that you're not endorsing, but you want students to engage with this, I think that's important. And I give one example in the book, there was a debate years ago about whether Ku Klux Klan members should be invited to a campus. And ultimately there was a big uproar, and they decided, okay, well, you could do it off the campus. Well, what was the class? It was a journalism class about how you interview a white supremacist. And I was very involved in the pushback against David Duke when I was running for statewide office in Louisiana. I could tell you, the media didn't have a clue how to interview him effectively. They'd ask him, are you a racist? He said no, move on to something else. They'd ask another question. They didn't know how to hold his feet to the fire. So, there are opportunities here from examining hateful speech on a campus as if you're looking at it at a microscope.
First of all, Ken, I'm glad you brought up the Ahmadinejad case. I supported Richard Haas and those at the Council on Foreign Relations who brought him there. That was the less public event on that same visit you talked about. But I would also add a lot of people have buyer's remorse from that particular visit. I don't think we should also dwell too much. He's a singularly, let's just say, not every case presents lessons that are generalizable. And in many respects, if we had more time, I'd like to dig a little deeper with you on Ahmadinejad, because I think there was some abuse of the platform in both the Columbia, the CFR, and then there was a third. I forget the other event that he did. Can I just draw you out real quick on the
Sure.
first part of Sahar's question, which was about definitions? Because a lot of people on the call may not know. If you could squeeze into a capsule or a snapshot the comments you made in public about the IRA definition
Sure.
Around the time of the Trump decision and why you think that's relevant going forward?
Yeah, and it's the reality is, as I put it, as I mentioned in the book and in my talk, is that this is a tool to try to disfavor certain speech because you have to consider that speech as a evidence when you're evaluating a claim on anti-Semitism. So it does a number of things that I find reprehensible. As I talked in my earlier part of remarks, I'm against hate speech codes. And this is a hate speech code in effect, but adopted by a legal body. And to me, that's a problem. Secondly, there's an internal debate inside the Jewish community about whether being Jewish requires one to have certain views about Israel. Can one be an anti-Zionist and be Jewish? And it's a difficult debate. I mean, inside the Jewish community, I think most people would say Satmar Jews who are anti-Zionist are part of the Jewish fabric. But there are young people who I met who came up in Jewish day schools who are, the story is usually like, how did it take until I got to college that I heard there was such a thing as the occupation? Why were people hiding that from me through my whole day school experience? What's going on here? Why are they treating me this way? And maybe leading to a point where they became an anti-Zionist, either by theology, because Jews have to repair the world and look how we're treating Palestinians, or by ideology. And that's a very difficult debate. I don't know if it can be decided. I don't know, how it should be decided. I just don't like, from a church-state perspective, Congress deciding this and saying, as Kushner put in his op-ed, our position is that anti-Zionism is by definition anti-Semitism. As I point in my book, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't, but to put a definition like this is problematic. The other parallel, one of the things that I've written about for years in looking at any form of bigotry is to play a thought experiment. Cut and paste a different group into the same scenario and see if the same rules apply. When I was writing about the militias in the middle 90s, I was arguing that these were black guys with guns talking about the need to shoot federal officials. The federal government would have taken it much more seriously than they did prior to the Oklahoma City bombing. So do a cut and paste here too. For Title VI, there's never any definition of racism or anything else that the federal government has to consider when evaluating a claim. But if you put together a parallel definition to the IRA definition, with the specific examples, would you include opposition to Black Lives Matters as an example of racism? Opposition to affirmative action as an issue of racism? Opposition to the removal of Confederate statues or the Confederate flag as an issue of racism? You would not want to have those specific things that are just expressions being classified and declared by the government as always indices that you have to look at of racism. It's much more nuanced and involved, and it prioritizes certain speech over others. And that's the core of the free speech concerns that I have, not going way beyond this, why I'm very much of a free speech person, is I'm always afraid when the government can put its thumb on the scale of expression. Because if you look historically, the government doesn't suppress expressions that you or I might not like. It suppresses expression that the government doesn't like. And again, I mentioned that in my upbringing, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, are very much informed by the fact that the protection of free speech was very important for those social movements. And I'm very concerned when people say, let's have the government have more regulations that prohibit certain types of speech, especially when it comes to a campus.
Thanks, Ken. A couple of questions. One, in terms of what you spoke about before in terms of functional empathy, could you give an example either from the book or look today, looking forward, how you would conduct that or implement that, both in the classroom and on the campus. And I would add, for a lot of us on this call, it's a majority academic and academic stakeholder audience, and some people who write about this arena quite frequently. We live in two different worlds. There's the classroom and there's the campus, and they're often very, very different parallel realities. That's one question. And then second, I might have either flubbed or some other questions on top of Paul's have come in. There's 4 or 5 people in the audience who were asking about, some are seeing more hints. Here, we're going off the campus now. Some are seeing more signals and signs of the Black Lives Matter and the social unrest and the demonstrations this summer, tying and connecting to issues of Israel and the conflict. And others are saying, no, that seems to be something from 4 or 5 years ago, from a Black Lives Matter movement, which is different from the slogan and the mass demonstrations. And just to kind of illustrate it, someone in the former camp who's on the call, who's on the program, Gary Gilbert, he said he just saw something passing around on email, a webinar sponsored by the BDS sanctions movement that has a title. Again, who knows what this is indicative of, but the title floating around: Black Lives Matter, Israeli Annexation, and BDS, Anti-Apartheid, Anti-Colonial Perspective. So to kind of sum up what's happening on the chat line, do you see much, did you see before what others saw 3, 4, 5 years ago of some intersections between the BLM movement as it was constituted before? And are you not seeing those now? And the earlier question about functional empathy. Thank you.
Okay, well, let me do the functional empathy first, then I'll do the Black Lives Matter one. So the functional empathy, I think the Natasha and Paul's class does that. So I think there are a lot of ways to do that in a classroom to really force students to think and to, when I teach about anti-Semitism, there's usually when we obviously talk about the Nazi period, and there's usually a kid whose response is, "This is yucky. How could people actually think that way?" And, I really very respectfully jump down their throats and say, well, if you were living in the 1930s and this was the norm and this was the mainstream and this is how your neighbors felt and this is what you were hearing in the media and what your leaders were saying, the chances are you would have had the same views too. So, to really take them out of their, the world is exactly how I, think about it, and to try to put themselves in different positions, I think is an important thing. The simulation that Paul and Natasha ran, I thought was brilliant to really put that on steroids, but I think you can do that in teaching as well. On the campus itself, I think it's important to create the environment that says that we invite in different perspectives, not to say that we just give them a free pass, but to do it in a way that builds the educational model. So what do I mean by that? At Bard, I have a colleague named Roger Berkowitz who runs the Hannah Arendt Center, and one of his programs is called Tough Talks. So he's intentionally looking for people to come in with, not Looney Tune views, but difficult views and views that people might reject. I mean, he brought in, I don't know how the student graduated from Bard, giving its reputation, but there's a student from a Bard alum who was working at Breitbart a few years ago, and there was a pushback against it and so forth. But Roger thought it was important to hear these types of views. And when you create the norm that a campus is going to be a place, and invitation does not equal endorsement, I think that's an important thing to do. And I have other things in the book too about how I think the cultivation of that environment that looks for those opportunities to bring in people with diverse views, and to say you're doing this for the educational purpose, not just to for some political or other purpose, I think is important. In terms of the Black Lives Matter, I don't know where this is going to go. It's right, there's a movement for Black Lives had a platform that basically linked it with anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian activism. But it's not a monolithic movement. There are different groups and so forth. I know people that, including friends in that movement, who have worked on issues of related to Israel and anti-Semitism. And this isn't new. I mean, I remember when I was working as a lawyer, in my 20s for the American Indian movement. There were people there that were, pro-Palestinian because their narrative was we're indigenous like they are, and how can we not be supportive of them? And the PLO was actually giving the American Indian movement a platform at the UN. And there were people that were saying, no, we're very much like the Zionists in that, we're trying to reclaim a little bit of our historic homeland surrounded by hostile others. And that's the narrative that we see connection to. So there's a lot of people taking their sort of larger politics and putting that on. And it's a larger framework too. And I discuss some of this in the book. It relates to the question of Jews and whiteness and privilege. There's some that want to put Jews as white, and then therefore anti-Semitism really shouldn't exist because it's a question of the people that are oppressors oppressing the oppressed, and Jews are white, and therefore how could they have a complaint versus those who know the full history of anti-Semitism. So people seek alliances, people seek politics, and part of the problem is that these filters reflective of how we deal with the whole question of anti-Semitism, let alone just the Israel question in the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the things that I see evidence of, and I see it on the left and I see it on the right, is if people's position on Israel is one that you agree with, you discount anti-Semitism from people that share your perspective on the left and on the right. Give them a pass. And that's a dangerous thing. I think the same sort of dynamic and thinking is happening here too. People see either allies or they think the world should be, people of color and people that are not of color, and which box they put Jews in. So a lot of things are happening there. Questions about Israel and policing. People will find opportunities to either bring it in to the mix. And there are people I know in the Black Lives movement for Black Lives who are very cognizant of the concerns about anti-Semitism and vilification of Israel as opposed to Israeli policy, and have been active and quietly in other ways of broaching these issues. How that will play out if annexation happens, I don't know. I think that becomes a much more difficult conversation. That's why, I really don't want to predict the future.
We have 3 or 4 more minutes. We are not going to annex people's afternoon.
Okay.
Let me just ask, Sahar, I couldn't tell from the different icons. Did you have a follow-up?
No, but if I have a chance just for half a...
Sure, I'll give you a second, and then also if I can ask Ronnie or Lesker, if you want to follow Sahar and add something, if you still want to add on the Black Lives Matter question. Sahar, please.
I just wanted to elaborate, or to really get a clarification rather, on the part about the hate speech. But this is very important. Like, how do we define this term hate speech? In a previous Israel Studies Zoom session, we were talking about the notion that, quote unquote, words can kill, that words can be inflammatory, they can be dangerous, they can potentially even cost people their lives, right? So I really want to just get a little bit more clarification from you on this particular point, which is very important. Like, obviously, we came to some kind of agreement. I hope that, certain speech can be protected, other speech cannot be or should not be protected. But when it comes to hate speech in particular, it can be a very slippery slope. And you said something about it can be protected under the First Amendment to the Constitution, but if it calls for, quote unquote, dangerous action on the ground, like, go out and burn this place or kill these people, then it's not protected. So I think we need more elaboration and more clarification. Sure. On this particular point, please.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you for that. So if you look at the First Amendment jurisprudence, and it comes from judges on the right and justices on the left, it has to be, not just speech that has a tendency to inflame. It has to be a real emergency type of situation. It has to be imminent, and it has to be clear. So I can articulate, I think all X should be killed, but again, if I'm going to do it in a way that it's right next to somebody that maybe hit with a baseball bat, that's probably, it's easier to think of it as expression versus intimidation and harassment, because speech, is one way to do it, to express, but art and other things, written forms, are other ways too. One of the people that was promoting the legislation, and the state legislation, that's the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, was a rabbi who said, correctly, words, Hitler didn't kill anybody with his hands. Words cause people to die. And he was right. The other thing that created the opportunity for Nazi Germany was the suppression of disfavored speech. And, think about all the words that can be used to propel hateful action. If you look at Jewish history, and you wanted to find the one book that may have been an inspiration for, many, atrocities, the Bible. I mean, the Bible has very positive things about treat your brother as yourself. It also has very negative things too. And so nobody's going to suppress the Bible because people may be animated by that and take those ideas. So the point is that the way to combat speech is not with suppression. It's with a bunch of other tools that give it a hateful speech a cost. And this, maybe is a good place to end. One of the campus examples that I put in the book is that there were some Jewish students from J Street who were very eager to not let Steve Bannon, the alt-right Breitbart guys, speak at the University of Chicago. They said it's hateful, it's verbal violence, there's no way he should be able to speak. They weren't just about they were saying about deplatforming. And my response to them was, look, you have an opportunity here. Don't make it about censorship. Turn it around on its head. And I gave a model that I used off the campus, but it worked very well. You may recall a few years ago, there was a attempted march in Western Montana after the Jewish community and human rights workers there had death threats. And it was going to be a march of armed neo-Nazis. And what we did is we used social media to create a movement back against it. We said, okay, we're not going to say these folks can't march, but if they do, they're going to be raising money for things that they test. Let them raise money for lawyers, for people that are victimized by hate crimes, for police training, education, and so forth. Gave the people in the community the sense that people had their back. It gave people outside something they could do, and it was a disincentive to these folks who ended up not showing up. So I said on the campus, instead of saying, let hateful, Bannon's going to be speaking, it's going to be hateful, don't let him, have them raise money for the kids that are being in cages in the, on the border with Mexico. Have them raise tons of money for those lawyers. So there are ways of not making it a censorship or free speech issue. And what I worry about is there's no clear definition of it. There's this, this Bannon is hateful. If this person's hateful, you get to, so one tick below a Hitler, or 2 ticks below a Hitler, or 3 ticks. I don't want government making distinctions.
I think everyone on the call, whether they agree or not, appreciates your view. But let me just press you a little bit further, Ken. Sure. Whether it's Ahmadinejad, whether it's Bannon, or whether it's someone else, you name the person with the controversies or the noxious views. Let's say all of us agreed inclusion, not exclusion. We're going to set the bar very low. As you said a little bit earlier, an invitation does not equal an endorsement. Fine. Could you give us 2, 3, 4? What would be your MO, your modus operandi to make sure that a university, we're only talking about universities for your book and on this call, that platform is not abused? How do you make sure that the person doesn't have an open mic? Take us through, you gave us that one example, I'm not sure I understood it, about social media and a counter movement, but let's say you're managing that stage, that event. How do you convey and steer it so that that platform does not become an endorsement?
Well, I think again, what Bollinger did with Ahmadinejad was a good example. What he did is, before Ahmadinejad came, he circulated to the community what he anticipated doing. He thought through that he was going to speak before Ahmadinejad because he knew that if he spoke in rebuttal, Ahmadinejad might leave the stage and he'd be speaking to an empty stage. He reached out very broadly inside Columbia and outside to say, what should my remarks be? What else should I include? What am I not thinking of? How do I construct? And he put staff time into thinking that through. So it's not just it has to be thought through. It has to be very carefully done. It has to you have to realize when you're running this type of a program on a campus that there are going to be people that are going to be very upset by that, and you have to figure out how do you mind that in a way that it's clear that it's not endorsement, and it may be opportunities for good things. I mean, what I pointed out in the book is that nobody anticipated that Ahmadinejad was going to go off on this rant of there are no gay people in Iran, and it wasn't clear from his context about whether he thought that it just didn't happen or that they killed them all. But regardless, that vignette allowed a Saturday Night Live skit, a cover of a New Yorker. He was ridiculed by it. So when you take the opportunity of that to use it as a further educational vehicle, and I think that in the whole, it's an opportunity also, as I mentioned in the book, for journalist students, for aspiring lawyers, to think through, okay, you have somebody that you fundamentally disagree with. How do you, construct that conversation on a campus? So it's difficult, it's labor intensive, but I think it's a much more valuable exercise than saying, we're going to shelter our students from hearing these things.
Thank you, Ken. The Ahmadinejad anecdote in particular left me feeling a little uncomfortable, which is what you said we need to be doing in the classroom. So you've been a great professor the last hour and 15 minutes. For anyone who wants to be in touch with Ken, if you can't find him, he's easy to find. But be in touch with us at the Gildenhorn Institute and the Jewish Studies Department at Maryland. The Conflict Over the Conflict, University of Toronto Press, 2020. It's available now, Ken? Yep.
Yep. Here it is.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I appreciate everyone who joined us today. Be well.
Thank you. Thank you all. Take care. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.